If you're looking at Afghanistan, if you're looking at Iran, if you're looking now at Ukraine, Biden is acting in every aspect of his foreign policy. He's advancing positions that are antithetical to American national interests.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. It's difficult to know where exactly the crisis over a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine will end. Yet no matter whether Russian President Vladimir Putin seizes more of the former Soviet satellite nation, conquers it entirely, or winds up leaving it alone, the shock to the international system that his threats have caused isn't limited to the future of Eastern Europe. That's not easy for many Americans to comprehend. The reaction to the possibility of a country whose independence was guaranteed less than 30 years ago by both the United States and Russia being invaded or destroyed is headline news. But it would be a stretch to say that most Americans are up in arms about it. They are far more concerned by domestic debates about record inflation and whether or not pandemic-related restrictions on normal life should be lifted after 2 years of dealing with the virus. Indeed, a considerable portion of the American public, on both the left and the right, isn't merely indifferent to the fate of Ukraine, but openly hostile to the notion that guaranteeing that country's borders against incursions, whether minor, as President Joe Biden said in a gaffe last month, or major, is in the interests of their nation. You don't have to be an apologist for Putin to acknowledge that Americans are sick and tired of foreign entanglements. They also wonder why an administration that spent its first year in office turning a blind eye towards the virtual collapse of security on the U.S. border with Mexico should treat lines on a map between Ukraine and Russia as sacrosanct. Those arguments are strengthened by the fact that most European countries, especially Germany, don't seem so alarmed about what is happening in their backyard. But if Americans think that the dust-up between Russia and Ukraine has nothing to do with their security or the future of their country, they're wrong. The same goes for those who care about the future of Israel. The rights and wrongs of the argument between Russia and Ukraine need not detain us. Even if you don't care much about the Ukrainians, what is happening to them is a direct consequence of a perception on the part of Moscow and its new and even more dangerous ally, China, that we are now living in a world where they and other rogue nations like Iran need no longer worry about U.S. power or its presence on the world stage. That collapse of influence didn't begin last January, though Biden's feckless handling of foreign affairs in his first year in office has accelerated a downward spiral begun by his two immediate predecessors. The unpopular notion of America as a global policeman was, by the end of the George W. Bush presidency, thoroughly discredited by dissatisfaction with the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Former President Barack Obama thought the United States would be better off if it apologized more for its alleged sins and pulled back from a position of strength abroad. He scoffed at the notion that Americans should be concerned about Russia when he mocked his opponent, current Senator Mitt Romney, in their 2012 foreign policy debate by saying, "The 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back," and then did nothing 2 years later when Putin illegally seized the Crimea from Ukraine. Obama also set about rearranging America's commitments in the Middle East, pulling out of Iraq, which led to the emergence of the ISIS terrorist group, and seeking to come to a rapprochement with the Islamist regime in Iran, even if it meant downgrading relations with allies like Israel and Sunni Arab states such as Saudi Arabia. The nuclear deal he championed claimed to avert the peril of Tehran acquiring a nuke. In fact, it really meant that the United States was acquiescing to its eventually becoming a nuclear power. He backed down on a threat to punish Syria's Bashar Assad for using chemical weapons on his own people, and then punted responsibility for that catastrophe to Russia and Putin, sending a loud and clear message about the end of the American era as a global hegemon. His successor, former President Donald Trump, consistently used rhetoric that gave that impression too, that he was leading America away from the international stage. He deprecated NATO, sought at times to ingratiate himself with Putin, though that was just as true of Obama, and threatened repeatedly to withdraw from Syria and tried to orchestrate another from Afghanistan. Trump's actions, however, didn't match the neo-isolationist tone he often adopted. He smashed ISIS and sought to correct Obama's mistaken empowerment and enrichment of Tehran, tried to force it to give up its nuclear quest by starting a campaign of maximum pressure in the form of severe economic sanctions. For all of his fawning on Putin, Trump was actually far tougher on him than either Obama or Biden. And in spite of his comments, or perhaps because of them, he forced America's European allies to pay more for their own defense, strengthening NATO. While Biden likes to talk like the traditional leader of the free world, his actions have given the lie to that stance. His return to appeasement of Iran has only strengthened the Islamic Republic's ability to threaten the world. Even worse, Biden's disgraceful pullout from Afghanistan, in which he betrayed not only U.S. allies, but endangered the Americans he left behind, solidified America's new reputation as the cowardly lion of the international scene. The repercussions from Afghanistan are being felt everywhere, as America's enemies are now emboldened. That's been made clear by China's threats to the independence of Taiwan, and now by Putin's move to take the next step to strangle what's left of Ukraine. An international scene that was dominated by a sole superpower was far from perfect. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the United States was slow to recognize the threat from Islamist terrorists. Then, after the 9/11 attacks, it was even slower to realize that a crusade for democracy in the Middle East, or even an attempt to sort out an age-old problem like Afghanistan, wasn't going to have a happy ending. Still, the collapse of Afghanistan is seen by foes like Russia and China as a signal. They think they no longer have to worry about an America that is too preoccupied with its own troubles and led by a weak leader, surrounded by staffers whose faith in multilateralism and diplomacy for its own sake will always prevent it from acting decisively to protect its interests or those of its international partners. This is also an administration that has largely accepted revisionist lies about America being an irredeemably racist nation, and one that, as the Vice President Kamala Harris and others on the left insist, have no business speaking up for human rights elsewhere so long as it is imperfect at home. In a post-American world, large-scale wars like the one that may happen in Ukraine, which were unimaginable in the not-so-distant past, are now very real possibilities. Small countries that look to international opinion and a strong United States to ensure their independence are now pretty much on their own. And rogue states like Iran can be forgiven for thinking the United States is no longer committed to not appeasing them, no matter what the cost. A weak America doesn't mean just a dismal fate for Ukraine. A budding Chinese superpower will be further seeking to limit America's influence and undermine its security. It means that after the next Iran deal, Tehran will be emboldened to further aggression and threats against Israel and regional Arab countries alike. And if Americans think all this will have no repercussions for their economic security, then they haven't been paying attention to what's also been going on in Europe and Asia. Given that the United States is in no position to stop Putin, reversing these losses will be difficult. It would mean a reaffirmed commitment to reasserting power in order to save Taiwan, as well as backing away from the appeasement of Iran. Right now, that seems unimaginable, especially with an American surrender to Iran in the nuclear talks being held in Vienna, seeming already a done deal. Nor is it easy to imagine an administration still obsessed with demonizing its domestic political foes and crippled by leftist intellectual fashions that have undermined belief in American exceptionalism, being able to assert itself again on the global stage. The threats to Ukraine will be the least of America's worries, if we are now living in a world in which Washington is neither respected nor feared. And now to our interview of the week. It's axiomatic that when tyrants embrace, friends of liberty should tremble. That's the way I think we should be thinking about the spectacle of the presidents of Russia and China embracing at the Winter Olympics. But while the muscle flexing of these two dangerous powers as America retreats from the international stage is worrisome, especially with regards to Ukraine, the encouragement that Putin got from President Joe Biden's disgraceful abandonment of Afghanistan has helped set the stage for what is happening now in Eastern Europe. But America's return to a policy of appeasement of Iran is also playing a part in this drama. It bears asking, why is the United States so committed to returning to Obama's dream of rapprochement with the Islamist regime? And what is it that the band of Obama alumni who are back running American foreign policy under Biden really want in the Middle East? Do they truly envision a sea change in which alliances with Israel and the Arab Sunni states are downgraded and Iran is treated as a U.S. partner of some sort? How can they justify a return to a weakened Iran deal that will expire in just a few years and lead to Tehran getting a legal nuclear weapon, which also ignores its status as the world's leading state sponsor of terror? And if America is no longer respected on the international stage, what will that mean for Israel? Must it make its own peace with Russia and China, regardless of the repercussions for its alliance with the United States? Will a new nuclear deal impel Israel to take action to prevent Iran from getting a weapon on its own, or actually prevent it from acting? And what's the future of the current Israeli government with its unwieldy, yet historic coalition composed of parties of the left, right, center, and an Arab partner? Has it helped to ease Israel's political wars, or has it made things worse and undermined the progress that former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made on a number of fronts? Was his ouster, which remains the only issue that unites the government, worth the respite it has given the political class? To discuss these issues and more, we have one of the keenest and most sought-after commentators on the Israeli scene. Caroline Glick is a senior columnist for Israel Hayom and Newsweek, and the host of the Caroline Glick Mideast NewsHour podcast. Her columns also appear in JNS. Formerly with the Jerusalem Post and Ma'ariv, she's the author of The Israeli Solution, a one-state plan for peace in the Middle East, and of Shackled Warrior, Israel and the Global Jihad. A native of the United States and a veteran of the Israel Defense Forces, she covered the U.S. invasion of Iraq while embedded with the U.S. Army, and since then she has become one of the most widely read journalists in Israel. She currently lives in Efrat. Caroline Glick, welcome to Top Story.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on your show, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Caroline, we're thrilled to have you with us this week. And I want to start with the ongoing crisis between Ukraine and Russia. And what do you think are the ramifications of what seems to be a spectacle that centers in part on America's inability to influence events as much as on what Putin is doing? And what conclusions do you think Israelis should draw from these events?
Okay, well, that's a broad question. I'll just say briefly about Ukraine and Russia is that I find it very weird that the party that seems most hysterical and beating the war drums most hysterically really is the one party that stands only to lose, and in fact already has lost tremendously from this entire story, which is the United States. I mean, the United States doesn't have any good options here. They don't have a military option. They already said that it's off the table, and even if they pretended that it was on the table, then they would be bluffing, because you're talking about a country that's at Russia's doorstep. The United States doesn't have any allies in NATO that want to go to war over this or that are capable of doing so. And from an economic perspective as well, it's not clear how much leverage the United States has in terms of sanctions on Russia at this point. Russia, of course, is an energy exporter. So if they were going to sanction Russian energy exports, the people who would mainly be harmed by this are America's allies in Europe. So it would be a hard sell either economically or militarily, or not sell. It's not clear at all what game the United States thinks it's playing here, because all they really can do is yell from the sidelines, but they don't have a lot of power to change the course of events here. And I think the thing that's most amazing is that what Putin is engaging in here is gunship diplomacy. He's using force and a display of force to get things, and he's already gotten a lot of things. He's he's exposed the fissures in NATO and really rendered it a spent force simply by being there, because Germany right now is acting much more as an ally to Putin in this than they are as an ally to the United States. Um, Chancellor Scholz was in Moscow earlier this week, and he said that he believes that Ukraine should be Finlandized, that they should be like Finland was during the Cold War, which means that they can have democracy internally, but that they can't have a foreign policy that's antithetical to Russian interests, just as Finland was towards the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And the thing about it is that this wasn't Scholz's idea. This is basically what Putin has been advocating for since 2007. Most recently, he wrote it up in an article that he published last year. So it's actually the German chancellor who's mouthing Putin's positions as the German chancellor, as a major NATO member. And Biden, in many ways, also brought it on the United States himself by greenlighting Nord Stream 2, which connects Germany directly to Russia, and sidelines the Baltic states and Ukraine with its supply of gas to Europe and Poland. So it's just sort of um, it's strange. I mean, Biden's game here apparently is that he's betting that Putin won't do anything, and then he can claim credit for Putin not invading. But in the meantime, the United States will have lost, has already lost strategically in an extraordinary way. And as for Israel, I think that everybody looking at this spectacle has to come away from it. I mean, a lot of people in Israel pointing to the agreement from 1994 that the United States essentially gave Ukraine security guarantees if it gave up its nuclear arsenal, and it that in and of itself proves that Israel mustn't trust any outside power to defend it or to defend its security. And it can only defend itself. It can only depend on itself. But I think also, if you just look at the overall crack up of the rationality of U.S. foreign policy since Biden came into office, and it wasn't that rational, since 9/11 in many ways. A lot of the major things that the United States has done have harmed American national security over the last couple of decades. But it's gone off the charts. I mean, it's gone off the rails, is what it's done. I mean, if you're looking at Afghanistan, if you're looking at Iran, if you're looking now at Ukraine, I mean, Biden is acting in every aspect of his foreign policy. He's advancing positions that are antithetical to American national interests.
Yeah, I think you're right to sort of connect the dots between Iran and certainly what happened in Afghanistan and what's going on now in Europe, because it's clear whatever restraints Putin in Europe might have felt, and this involves China with its threats towards Taiwan as well. They're feeling they're feeling obviously much bolder about challenging American talking points. And you're right, Biden's bluffing about Ukraine, but you speak of like the importance of Ukraine. I mean, Democrats impeached Trump for supposedly not being sufficiently pro-Ukraine. So I guess they're kind of stuck with this, aren't they?
My friend Lee Smith, I was just reading it over now because I'm writing about this issue for my Friday column for Israel Hayom this week. But he wrote this article in late January where he was talking about how, and it's not the first time that it's come up, but how the Russia conspiracy lie against Trump that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and then later the FBI and the CIA were trumpeting against Donald Trump and his associates really made it impossible for the United States, the Trump administration first and now the Biden administration, to have a rational policy regarding Russia. I mean, there were deals that the United States could have made with Russia beginning, as far back as, going pretty far back, going, to the 2010s in Syria and going forward, and in regards to China and in regards to Iran. And because of the lie that they told about Trump, then claiming wrongly that he was an agent of Russia. And now we've seen that this is much deeper with the latest, latest revelations from the special prosecutor John Durham this week. Right. We're seeing that this was a very deep and wide conspiracy, and it was directly dispatched by Clinton and her campaign. But Trump and Mike Flynn, his first national security advisor, wanted to have outreach towards Russia, on Syria and Iran, and they weren't able to do it. They were unable to do any of it because the minute that they tried, or Flynn was out early on, but that Trump would have wanted to do something in that direction, and he did try. He was immediately castigated as a Russian stooge, and so he couldn't go on. And the easy play then was to just wreck U.S.-Russian relations. And now, obviously, and Ukraine, I mean, in a way, they also deserve what they're getting right now, because they're very, very corrupt. They've been corrupt all along, and they thought that they could get involved in U.S. politics, in U.S. presidential politics. I mean, going as far back as 2016, at the behest of the Obama administration, the Clinton campaign, the Ukraine ambassador to the United States wrote an anti-Trump op-ed in the middle of the campaign that he published in the Hill magazine. So Ukraine was very involved with the impeachment of Donald Trump in 2019, and before that, in drumming up the conspiracy that he was a Russian agent in the earlier years of his administration. So they were playing this American politics game. And it's possible that they thought that if they were going to do this, that the United States was going to pull their fat out of the fire if the Russians took an action against them. But it's also reasonable to think that the Russians themselves took the action against Ukraine that they took back, in the fall, when they started deploying troops to the border, because they thought that these crazies who were bringing down their own government with lies about Russia were going to try to destabilize Putin's government now that they're in power. I mean, it could very well be seen, given the real craziness of what these people have been doing in undermining U.S. national security interests, primary national security interests, to destabilize the presidency of Donald Trump. I mean, that was a theory that Lee put in his article. And the truth is that Biden's behavior is so irrational. It's so antithetical to American national security interests on Iran, obviously on Afghanistan, even on China, that it's hard to dismiss the possibility, that Putin is acting defensively in going on offense against Ukraine, that has been playing the Democrats against Russia, and very successfully at that since 2014 or 2013, actually.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point to sort of past deals with Russia. I mean, after all, President Obama really was reaching out. They tried the reset, famously with Hillary Clinton, and then, Obama's famous, live mic moment when he told Medvedev, Putin's deputy, to tell Vladimir, I'll have more flexibility in my second term. So it's not like these things didn't happen on the other side. Let's turn a bit to Iran. Can you place sort of the context of these negotiations that have been going on in Vienna, where the Biden administration was sure that Iran was just waiting for Biden to, become president, and then they would happily, go back into the old Iran deal. That didn't play out. The Iranians are much tougher. They are negotiating as they did originally with Obama, 9 years ago. They want a weaker deal before they'll sign anything or go back into it. Can you place this in the context of this same problem that, Biden is involved in Europe, where, sometimes talking tough, but can't back it up. And inevitably, it's always about appeasement.
Look, I think the Iran diplomacy, if you can call it that, that Biden is engaging in Vienna and in other areas is really, I think it's primarily about domestic politics. Um, I think that there's not any strategic thinking going on. I don't think that there's any reasoning behind what they're doing that has any foreign policy basis. I mean, maybe, but if there is, it's turgid and it's insipid. I mean, it's just stupid. It doesn't make any sense from any perspective, any sort of lens that you want to look in it. Idealist, realist, isolationist. I mean, none of them can come up with a policy that Biden is advancing towards Iran, which is capitulation. I mean, he's just giving in to everything. He's giving them the bomb, and he's giving them money, and he's giving them legitimacy, and he's selling all of the U.S.'s allies, Israel, the Arab states down the river. He's imposing sanctions on Saudi Arabia, on Egypt, denying weapons sales to the UAE. I mean, it's why he took the Houthis off of the terror list when they're engaging in terrorism before his very eyes every day against not only the UAE and their government and their civilian population, but also U.S. bases. He's going after U.S. servicemen and women. So, I mean, the Houthis are, which is an Iranian proxy in Yemen. So, where is the rationale for what they're doing? And I think it's easier to find in domestic politics than it is to find in foreign policy. So here you have a situation where in 2014, 2015, Obama was openly negotiating the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And it was very controversial, right? I mean, he did not have majority support in the Senate. It wouldn't have passed if he had brought it before the Senate as a treaty. It was extremely controversial.
Nor would anything now, I might add.
This is true, but I mean, it was extremely controversial. It was extremely controversial among Democrats, and now and then Trump was elected, and it suddenly became this writ of faith among Democrats. The Democratic Party, the DNC, passed a resolution, I think, after Trump left the nuclear deal in 2018, that the next Democrat government that came in was going to reinstate the United States' signature to the JCPOA, was going to return to it. And it became what had been controversial for Democrats. So, forget about the Republicans. For Democrats, suddenly it would be controversial and a losing proposition to oppose it. So all of the Democrat candidates in 2020 were committed to going back to the JCPOA, all of them.
Including some critics of some who were originally critics of it.
Right. Exactly. And so it became the policy of the Democrat Party. You add to that the fact that Joe Biden appointed senior officials in his administration who are radical, hate Israel, despise Israel, like Meir Bitar, who's the intelligence director in the National Security Council, and many others, Hadi Amar, who's in charge of Israel and the Palestinian desk in the State Department. He's an assistant secretary of state, and they want to make him consul here if they can figure out a legal way to do that, which luckily they haven't been able to figure out yet. But he has some, and then Rob Malley, of course. But it's also, but I mean, I think that first and foremost, there's a commitment here to the Democratic base, to the progressive base that hates Israel, that likes Iran. I mean, these are like the Code Pink people that were meeting with the Iranian leadership in Tehran while the United States was fighting and Iran was running the insurgency against U.S. forces in Iraq. So this is a position that is widely held among the Democrats. Add to that, finally, the fact that since 1979, first Senator and then Vice President and now President Joe Biden was one of the most pro-Iranian politicians in Washington. And you end up with a policy that's just almost reflex, that by reflex, you're going to just be pro-Iranian, and you get to where you are today.
Yeah, I think that's true. Let's skip ahead, I guess, to what everybody assumes will be at some point. The Iranians will be satisfied with whatever Biden is giving. I mean, they keep asking for more. Biden keeps giving more. At some point, they may be willing to sign something that will, at best, reinstate, the 2015 deal, probably making it weaker. If the 2015 deal was bad for Israel, which was a consensus position across really the political spectrum in Israel, how much worse is this deal going to be? And sort of what are the consequences? What are the immediate consequences that Israel is going to face once, that ceremony in Vienna is held?
Well, I mean, I think that Israel is totally. I mean, our national security is undermined by the nuclear deal from 2015, and so obviously any follow-on deal that they may or may not get will be even more disastrous for Israel's national security. But I truly believe, and I believe this, and I said this going back for many years now, that the main thing undermining Israel's national security, I mean, given given Iran's quest for nuclear weapons, I would think that the main thing that's inhibited national security for Israel has been Israel's reliance on the United States and trust that the United States has our back on this issue when it's demonstrably false, and has been really since 2007, when in the end days of Bush's presidency in November 2007. The director of national intelligence published a national intelligence estimate that claimed that Iran had abandoned its nuclear weapons program in 2003, which was false. But the minute that that came out, any thought that the Bush administration, the President Bush, was going to lift a finger to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons was gone. And it was really that NIE from 2007 was what set up it set the conditions for Barack Obama's Iran policy. I mean, I think that without the last 2 years of the Bush foreign policy, it would have been more difficult for Obama to have pushed forward with his policy, which realigned the United States away from Israel and the Sunni Arab states and towards Iran and Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood and their terror and their other terror proxies.
Caroline, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and his partner, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, have been operating on the assumption that keeping all disputes with the United States private rather than engaging in public argument is in Israel's interest. You've just explained how badly Israel's interests are being harmed by Biden's policy. So it's easy to conclude that this strategy isn't working. They don't seem to have had the least influence on Biden, his approach to Iran, or anything else, have they?
No, and they won't. And actually, I mean, it really just shows also how Netanyahu came to the point that he came to, where he became the most outspoken critic of the Obama administration and of the Democrat policies regarding Iran. It's because he didn't have any choice. And I remember I had a conversation about it with him in 2015, before he went to Washington, where he gave his speech against the Iran deal before the joint houses of Congress, which is when, a lot of people faulted him for that, and they said that U.S. Israel relations soured when he did that because he went against the sitting American president. But if you go back and look at that speech, you see that it's a complete lie. I mean, first of all, despite it all, he was very full of praise. He was full of praise towards Obama in a very diplomatic way, which obviously, it was not true, but it was a very carefully crafted speech. He did not cast any aspersions on Obama at all. The houses, I think there were I think a couple dozen, maybe, or like around 20 Democrat lawmakers who did not come to the speech, but there were but all the other ones did, and they gave him standing ovations along with the Republicans. So I disagree and I dispute that claim. There was a bipartisan show of support for Israel when Netanyahu gave that speech. But I remember that in the conversation that I had with him before he gave the speech, he said, look, I don't have any choice. I mean, there's no point any longer of being diplomatic towards the Obama administration because they've gone over to the dark side. I mean, these are my words, not his. I'm not quoting him verbatim.
No, I
But that
understand.
was the sense that he gave, because that was a message that he gave, and it was true, because the minute that the Obama administration agreed that Iran had the right to enrich uranium, and the deal itself, and I don't know if we even realized it at the time, but that it gave them freedom to conduct research and development towards the development of advanced centrifuges and other technologies that they didn't have in 2015 and that they now have and are using. It gave up the game. I mean, this was not a non-proliferation agreement. It destroyed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty from 1971, and it destroyed 70 years of U.S. non-proliferation um, policy. In one fell swoop, it was a disaster. And there was no way that Israel could take this lying down. You had to speak out. And the reason why you had to speak out, and we're seeing it today, is that Israel does have allies in its fight against the Iran nuclear deal. The primary allies in this fight are the Arab states of the Persian Gulf that are equally threatened by Iran, as we see every day with the Iranian proxy assaults on the UAE and on Saudi Arabia. And they are terrified of Iran becoming a nuclear power, and they are Israel's allies in this fight, and they want Israel to lead on it. They trust Israel far more than they trust the United States, and they want to work with Israel against Iran. And the second group of allies that Israel has are the Republicans, and I dare say, the handful of sensible Democrats that are left in Congress. And they're also waiting for a clear voice from Israel. I mean, the Republicans have a much more difficult time standing up to the foreign policy of an administration, whether it's Obama or Biden today, if they're standing alone. If it's not Israel that's leading the charge. The minute that Netanyahu came in to Washington in March of 2015 and he gave his speech, that galvanized the Republicans to fight this with everything that they had. It was because Netanyahu came that there was a fight in the Senate over the JCPOA. It was because Netanyahu went to the United States that the nuclear deal became controversial. I mean, there's nobody in the United States. Americans don't really care that much about Ukraine because there's nobody there that's coming and making an impassioned claim. Look, what Biden is doing is crazy, or what have you, or dangerous to America. But Netanyahu came at a critical moment, and it was because of him that the Republicans and the sane Democrats were able to stand up and oppose it. And in fact, some of them were compelled to oppose it, even though they didn't want to, like Chuck Schumer, who said, I'm voting against it, but I'm not going to say anything bad about it. So,
Right.
and Ben Cardin did the same thing in Maryland.
Yeah, after all the talk from this current Israeli government about how unacceptable such a situation will be, if there is a revived nuclear deal, I guess the assumption has always been that Israel will act on its own to defend itself. But does a new nuclear agreement with the United States forestall any possible Israeli strike, especially with this no public disagreement policy? And where does that leave Israel and its allies, in the Arab world?
So, the truth is that I lose a lot less sleep as an Israeli over Biden and his insanity than I do over what I consider to be equal insanity on the part of our government. Because, I wasn't that nervous when Obama was president because I trusted Netanyahu to act in Israel's best interest. And Bennett and Lapid and Defense Minister Gantz do not give me any sense that I can trust them. To the contrary, the statements that they're making, their constant efforts to lobby Biden and to lobby Blinken and to lobby Jake Sullivan, and they're just not interested and they don't care, and they're happy to have Eyal Hulata, Bennett's national security advisor, go to Washington and meet with Jake Sullivan there, but they don't care about anything that he says. They're not impressed, and they're not interested in being convinced of anything because they didn't reason themselves into their position. You're not going to be reasoned out of it. They don't care.
Right.
This is what they want to do
Right.
because why do they have this foreign policy? Because they're like 8-year-olds. Why didn't you make your bed in the morning? Because, oh, well, there's your excuse. That's the justification for U.S. foreign policy towards Iran that empowers Iran and imperils U.S. allies and undermines completely U.S. strategic credibility in the Middle East.
Yeah. So you don't have any confidence that this government will strike Iran on its own, do you? I guess that's what you're telling me.
I'm telling you that I don't have any confidence that they're going to be able to, that they're equipped to make the right decision at the right time.
Yeah. Right. And that would be a very difficult thing to go against the United States, I think, for any Israeli government under those circumstances. Does this drive Israel even closer together with its allies in the Gulf? Or will some of those Arab states decide, that they're better off in the long run by working with Iran, if this is, where things are?
I don't think that any of them want to work with Iran. I mean, I think that they're all very clear about what Iran is and what threat it poses to them. I think that they're trying to figure out a way to diminish and, if possible, eradicate their dependence on the United States. We see this with weapon sales that they're doing more and more of with Russia and with China. And trying to develop better ties with both of those powers against the United States if necessary, because they no longer trust America, and I don't think that's likely to change with the Republican in power because too much has been broken. This is the second administration that's behaving in this way, and so I think that that's a big problem, and I think that they're desperate for Israel to take the lead. I mean, I think. We've had, just in the space of a couple of weeks, we've had President Herzog was in Abu Dhabi. You had Defense Minister Gantz signing security deal in Bahrain. And this week you have Bennett in Bahrain meeting with the king and the prime minister. They really want Israel to take the lead. But then Bennett and Gantz and Lapid all say that we're coordinating everything that we're doing with the United States, and the United States rushes in and says, "Oh, we're so pleased to see Bennett meeting with the leadership of Bahrain," as if we care, because we do, and that's the problem. That this is something that matters to our leaders, that they get some pat on the back from the White House for meeting with people who are terrified of Washington.
Yeah. There's always been this sort of strain within discussions about Israeli foreign policy that Israel has to, find an alternative to the United States, become more independent. That's always, run aground on the fact that there is no other real source that can replace the United States. China has been investing a lot in Israel. That's, angering a lot of people in America on both sides of the political divide. Are you concerned about the possibility that Israel is sort of playing it too close to the vest about China, or does it need to back off that, regardless of what's happening with Iran?
Look, I agree that China is a problem for the United States, and it's likely a problem for Israel as well. It's a very scary country. And I also have a podcast, the Caroline Glick Middle East News Hour, and I was speaking with my colleague and friend Victoria Coates, who was Deputy National Security Advisor, and she was the representative of the Secretary of Energy to Middle East and North Africa, like two weeks ago or so. And so she was saying on that score that it's great. Israel canceled contract with a Chinese company to build the light rail in Tel Aviv. But you would expect that when the United States is threatening or pressuring Israel not to have these contracts with Chinese infrastructure companies, that you would have, American companies lining up to get that contract. In other words, that Israel would be, that there would be a good offer on the table from an American firm to build these projects instead of China, whether it's a port in Haifa or railway lines linking Eilat to Ashdod or a light rail in Tel Aviv. You would expect that the Americans would say, okay, look, we don't want China to build you your infrastructure because we consider it a threat to our national security interests. And we don't think that it's really in your interest, although that's your business, not ours. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make it possible for you to have your light rail in Tel Aviv by lining up, company X, Y, and Z to make competitive bids on the project. And that would be a reasonable thing to do. It would be good for America because it would be getting American companies involved, which is a good thing for the U.S. economy, and it would be good for U.S.-Israeli partnership. And I think that that was a reasonable position for her to take. I don't think that the Americans don't have an alternative. There is no great power that is, like America. And I think, though, that the United States has been very treacherous towards Israel along a host of issues, notably since 9/11, but of course, not only in many, many ways. And I think that Israelis, we are now very powerful economically, much stronger, much more independent economically than we have been in the past. We're able to develop markets all over the world. And I think that the alternative to the United States is not Russia or China or India or anybody, it's Israel. I think that the one side that we have to rely on the most is our own. That's the whole reason that we have Zionism. That's the whole reason that we decided that we had to take our destiny in our own hands and build our country. We didn't come this far, almost 75 years as an independent state in order to just say, okay, well, sovereignty isn't that important. What's really important is for America to protect us. No, what's important is for us to realize why sovereignty is important and why we have to defend ourselves. And we can work with any number of different actors to advance our existential and other interests. And we should do that because there are a lot of people who want us to be strong and to work with us. And we should work with them to achieve common goals. And when necessary, we should be willing to work by ourselves. But we have to stop being so spoiled and pampered. And we have to stop thinking that some, Deus ex machina is going to come down from the sky in Act 3 and save us, because the people who are supposed to save us, our Deus ex machina, is us. It's Israel. It's the Jewish people. And that's what we should be focused on now. Not who's going to replace, Daddy Warbucks or whatever.
You've been a stern critic of the Bennett-Lapid government after 8 months in office. Do you think it has accomplished much, if anything, other than the ouster of Netanyahu, which was its, goal? And what do you think are the worst decisions it's made?
Look, I have nothing positive to say about this government. I think that this government it poses a danger to the very existence of Israel. And I'll say just one more thing on that. I mean, I think on every score they've undermined Israel's national interests economically, strategically, and Jewishly. And I think that's really something that we're learning here, right? We have a bare majority coalition of turncoat right-wing parties together with center-left, radical left, and the Muslim Brotherhood Party. They have a 61-seat majority in a 120-seat Knesset. So they can't lose one vote. Everybody has said, all of the BDS people, all of the two-state solution crowd, all of these people who think that Israel needs tough love have claimed for well over a generation that there's some sort of intrinsic contradiction between Israel being a Jewish state and Israel being a democracy. And what we see very clearly with this government is that there isn't any contradiction. That Israel ceases to be democratic, it also ceases to be Jewish. That is, they have to be together. By definition, it will always be democratic when it's a Jewish state. And by definition, if it isn't democratic, the Jewish identity of this country is going to be undermined. And I think that we're seeing that very clearly now with this government that's relying for its very existence on the Muslim Brotherhood Party, Ram. They are undermining Israel's Jewish identity, Israel's sovereignty in the Negev. They essentially surrendered the Negev to the Muslim Brotherhood over a series of actions that the government has taken towards non-enforcement of Israeli law, towards the Bedouin in the Negev, towards even just symbolically allowing Bedouin mobs to block Israel from planting trees on Jewish Arbor Day on Tu B'Shvat a couple of weeks ago. So, all of these things point to the exact same position. You also have anti-Zionist and post-Zionist members of Knesset from Meretz and the Labor Party who are in this government, and they don't support Israel as a Jewish state. And this government itself is fundamentally anti-democratic because it exists on the basis of lies that Naftali Bennett, who was a friend of mine, I thought, for 10 years before this happened, more than 10 years, betrayed everything that he promised, all of the positions that he's taken since he entered the Knesset for the first time in 2013 and formed this government, breaking every pledge that he made to his voters, including pledges that he made in writing on live television just days before the election in March, where he said he would never have a government with Lapid. He would never be in a government that made Yair Lapid prime minister, and that he would never form a government with Ram, the Muslim Brotherhood Party, in any way, shape, or form. And then he went and he did that. And so he's prime minister now with less than 5% of Israelis supporting him. His faction of 6 makes up 10% of the government. In all of the opinion polls, he's barely crossing the threshold to get into Knesset. He has no democratic legitimacy. Imagine Biden, everybody's saying his support is in the gutter. Only 41% of Americans support him. Only 5% on a good day of Israelis support our prime minister. 95% of Israelis don't want him in that position, never voted for him, never thought of him as a prime minister, and want him out. And here he is running around the world, presenting himself as the duly elected and constituted prime minister of Israel and enacting some of the most dangerous policies, whether it's towards Iran or towards the Bedouin, towards the Palestinians, towards religion and state in Israel, that we've ever seen.
Well, you referenced him being your friend. You were actually 2 years ago. It was exactly 2 years ago. Three. Yeah, you were. That's what I was about to say. You ran for the Knesset with him, so you know him.
I thought I knew him. It works out I didn't know him at all.
So, I mean, just, sort of on one foot, why do you think this happened? Was it just ambition, or, should we take, that his excuse was the alternative was, more stalemate, more elections. I couldn't let that happen. What is your take on that?
People in his faction, one of whom didn't join his government with him, my friend Amichai Shikli. Nobody cared what he had to say. He was a minor political player and he just stole the premiership. Why did he do this? Because he's a loathsome human being, because he doesn't have any appreciation for truth, because words don't mean anything to him, because what interests him is getting to be called Mr. Prime Minister and being buried on Mount Herzl next to Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion isn't buried there, next to other prime ministers. He likes the honors and the honorifics, and he likes being surrounded by a battery of guards. I think there's actually something very psychotic about this. I think that he wants to be Netanyahu. He has for a long time. I mean, he named his oldest son after Yoni Netanyahu. I think he has this idea that he's supposed to be Netanyahu, and he's constantly obsessed with Netanyahu, which is why almost all of his statements as prime minister involve attacking Netanyahu on every single issue that's totally unrelated to Netanyahu. He's been prime minister, as you said, for 8 months, and all he does is attack Netanyahu. Everything is about ignoring Netanyahu, attacking Netanyahu, blaming Netanyahu for everything. He can't let go of it, because now, I said to him, the last conversation that we had, I said to him, what the tragedy of Macbeth was in Shakespeare. I said the tragedy was Macbeth and his wife killed the king, killed Duncan. Now, it was a crazy thing to do because they had gotten a prophecy that said that Macbeth would be the next king. So if he had just waited his turn in line, right, Duncan would have died and he would have become king.
Well, he had a son in between there too, but yeah.
No, but he said the prophecy was that Macbeth was going to replace Duncan.
Right.
But they couldn't wait. So they killed him and then everything went to pot.
Right.
And when if Naphtali and Ayelet Shaked, his sidekick, were some of the most popular politicians in Israel. She was the most popular minister in Netanyahu's government from 2015 to 2019. I think undeservedly, but never mind that. The point is they both had very promising futures ahead of them, but they couldn't wait their turn in line. So they did what they did. And I mean, and he really did, a lot of us, considered him our friend for many years. And none of us can believe what he's done. And I'm talking not just myself, but many of my colleagues as well. We just look at it and we're stunned. We're stunned cold by what he's done. But there's no there's no positive explanation. And the thing about his claim, we were going to go to fifth elections, so what? I mean, that would have been more legitimate than what he did. And more to the point, the chaos that we were living under, with a very badly functioning or non-functioning or government, the joint government between Netanyahu and Gantz, was better than what we have now. I mean, as terrible as it was, I wanted to go to the fourth election. So I saw the polls and I thought, gee, maybe we can get rid of Gantz because he's terrible, and wouldn't that be great? But now we have something worse. We have a government that gave up Israeli sovereignty in the Negev to Bedouin gang who are represented by the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm. Do you? I mean, this is not that I want to spend tons of more time on this, but I guess I have to ask: do you think Netanyahu bears any responsibility for this denouement, or do you see it as just as a result of an unfair prosecution and sort of a political plot? I mean, does Bibi get off entirely without any blame here?
No, I mean Netanyahu, and I've been saying this also for many years. Netanyahu had to, and by the way, we see it with a lot of leaders. We see it in American Jewish organizations, even where you have a charismatic leader who does not groom successors, who does not surround himself with people who are younger, who he can trust, who he cultivates, who are loyal to him, but are also capable of moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, they don't so much not have successors as that they don't seem to believe in the concept.
And I think that Netanyahu is somewhat guilty of this. Now, the fact is, what we got instead of people, who should have been in there now in positions where they could, take the rings. And I had hoped, and I still hope, but I had hoped before Naphtali did this, that Netanyahu would have one more term. He would get us past Iran, right? He would get rid of the Iranian nuclear program through military strikes. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to turn off my phone so that it stops clicking. But that he would get rid of the Iranian threat. He put that out from under us, and that during those last 4 years that he would be able to cultivate and groom successors, and then he would leave at the age of 76, and that would be that. And that was what my hope had been. But look what happened. He was trying. There were these people who pushed their way in, and they had a right to. I mean, this is a free society. It's a democracy, and if you get the votes, and you're in. But they weren't good people. You had Gideon Sa'ar, who really is revealing himself to be a man who is motivated by hatred and desire for revenge for imagined crimes that Netanyahu committed against him and his pride, which is just sick. And you have Naphtali and Ayelet, who also are just liars in the most fundamental way, and have no compunction about turning their backs on the people who stood with them and their voters. Most importantly, your voters. to satisfy their personal ambitions. And these were not, and Netanyahu didn't want them. He was trying to get them out of politics. He was working against them, and that's fine. But if you want to work against somebody, you have to work for somebody. So if I were going to blame him for something, it's not that he was trying to push the likes of Gideon Sa'ar and Tzvika Hauser and Ayelet Shaked and Naftali Bennett and Sharon Haskel and all of these turncoats out of the Knesset or out of Likud or whatever. It's that he didn't develop the people who were worthy of taking high office in Israel, and that's his failing. But you mentioned the legal coup that we've experienced here, and it's hard to get your head around the parallels between what happened to Trump, what the Justice Department, the FBI, and the Democrats and the US media did to Trump to demonize him and to criminalize him and to undermine his presidency, and what Israel's legal fraternity, the courts, but particularly the state prosecution, the Attorney General's office, and the media, those three were the main culprits here, did to demonize, to criminalize Netanyahu, to undermine his authority and his powers, his ability to govern, in order to oust him from power here. The similarities, the parallels are uncanny. And I think it speaks to a larger question of the ability of democracies and democratic institutions to survive the digital age of easy access to information, legal or illegal, by powers that be, and the temptation of power and incredible contempt for the public by ruling classes in our countries.
Yeah, I want to ask one more question about this government. Many friends of Israel, including not just people on the left, will say that the inclusion of Ra'am, Mansour Abbas, as you say, the Muslim Brotherhood Party, in the government is whatever it is that he does while he's in the government, that it is, a public relations coup for Israel. It gives the lie to the apartheid state claims, and that this alone sort of makes it all worth it, or at least it makes having him in there worth it. What do you say about that argument?
I say that if you feel like you need to have proof that Israel is not an apartheid state, then you've lost the plot. I mean, the claim that Israel is an apartheid state is a blood libel. I mean, this is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. Everybody here, all citizens here, all residents here have equal rights before the law, or they're supposed to. Of course, we're seeing the law enforced prejudicially and with malice aforethought against the prime minister and against right-wing politicians in Israel in particular, and also against settlers and Jewish nationalists here. But be that as it may, Israel's not an apartheid state. Of course, that's a blood libel. Of course, that's a slander. And the idea that you have to prove that you're not a criminal is pathetic. So no, we didn't need to bring in a party that wants Israel annihilated to prove that we're not what everybody says. Because look, lo and behold, Mansour Abbas and his merry crew of terror supporters are in the coalition, right? And Amnesty International still put out its report saying that Israel was born in the sin of apartheid and that its very existence is a crime against humanity. So, a hell of a lot of good that did us, right? I mean, I don't think that Israel, or really any country, can make their policies based upon an attempt to convince enemies that are not interested in being convinced that it's not bad. They don't care. That's not why they're doing this. They're doing this because they hate Jewish people, and they don't want Jewish people to have a state. And they want to get us they want to be able to tell us what we can do and what we can't do, where we can live and where we can't live, who we are and who we aren't. And why would we ever care what they have to say? They hate us.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn back to the U.S.-Israel relationship. What's your prognosis? Obviously, the Democrats were influenced by their left wing, which has embraced intersectional myths about Israel, has strengthened the partisan split with Israel, with sort of Republicans being lockstep pro-Israel party, Democrats divided. How does this eventually play out in your mind?
Well, I mean, I think that they're also empowering neo-Nazis, right? I mean, neo-Nazis don't operate in a vacuum. They hear the discourse. You see David Duke embracing Ilhan Omar. I mean, I think, there's also a cross-generation of ideas among anti-Semites in the United States. So that's happening. I think Israel's answer is Zionism. I think, by the way, the answer for all Jewish people is Zionism. And I think that this isn't it's not like a revolutionary thing either for Jews or for human beings, which is that, you want to be self-sufficient. You want to be, you want to be independent. You want to be able to protect yourself. You want to be able to defend yourselves against people who wish you ill. And whether that's something that you need to do because, you need to have a gun when you go to, synagogue in Texas or in Pennsylvania or where have you, or whether it's you need to have your army and you need to have your country. I mean, it's the same logic that obtains in both situations. You don't want to be at anybody's mercy. Um, but I think so. It's Zionism, but it's also self-reliance. Um, but I think that the real problem is for American Jews as well. I mean, it's a problem for us if we're being led by anti-democratic post-nationalists who think that it's reasonable to have their very government for its existence to be relying on Israel's enemies who want to destroy the country. So that's bad. We're in a bad situation right now. But overall, the vast majority of Israelis are Zionists and want to maintain our country and are willing to defend it.
Caroline, you mentioned American Jewry and the problems of American Jewry. We hear a lot about a decline in support for Israel among young American Jews. And we also hear that this is, largely the function of politics or religious pluralism. Do you think that's true, or is it more about demography or decline in Jewish peoplehood within American Jewry itself and has very little to do with Israel?
I think it's all of the above. I think it's assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's failed Jewish education. I mean, it's not just that many American Jews are not being educated Jewishly, but that even those who are being educated Jewishly are being educated by institutions that are failing them, because their actual educators don't know what they're talking about in many respects. I think that there's a confusion among progressive Jews between Judaism and politics. I think that in many Jewish communities in the United States, progressive Jewish communities in the United States, Judaism has become a synonym for whatever the position of the Democrat Party is from time to time, and that's not true. So I think that there's been a real devaluation of and debasement of Judaism among a lot of American Jews, that's leading to, yet another generation of American Jews that is completely ignorant and has been denied its birthright to know what it means to be Jewish. And I think it's a theft. And I think it's a disaster, and it's a disaster for the American Jewish community. And I think it's a disaster for the Jewish people that this has been allowed to happen, and it's a great tragedy. And I think that being carried away by people who are telling them that Israel is bad and that as Jews they should be as a Jews, meaning their only Jewish identity should be able to be saying, as a Jew, I object to what Israel's doing, and you're seeing a lot of that going on as well with the anti-Israel activism. But I think that the anti-Israel activism is a testament to the failure of Jewish educational institutions in the United States, and frankly, to Jewish families not understanding how valuable Judaism is and how wonderful and how blessed they are to be Jews, and to take advantage of their identity and learn about it and embrace it in at least some of its richness. I mean, we have so much. Our history is so extraordinary. Our faith is so amazing, and we have so much to give to the world, and our heritage is so rich for ourselves and for our families that I think more than anything else it's a pity. It's terrible. It's a terrible tragedy that they're not enjoying this, that they're not seeing how wonderful it is to be a Jew. And that to me is the greatest tragedy. I think I'm so happy to be Jewish. I feel so blessed to be a member of this nation, and I think my children are as well. And I don't know. I feel sorry for people who don't have the opportunity to learn what it means to be Jewish.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I think you're absolutely right about the value of Jewish heritage and what people are missing out on, and why it's so important for them to try and learn about Israel, be inspired by it, and reconnect to those values. Caroline, I want to thank you so much for your time, your insights, and your perspective.
I
We
learn a
also want to
lot
thank.
from reading you as well, Jonathan. And I'm not saying that to butter you up, but you're doing a fantastic job, and I appreciate so much all the writing you've been doing on these issues.
Well, thanks very much. We also want to thank our audience. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us on the JNS YouTube channel or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And we'll see you again next week.